I had always considered myself a skeptic. All those myths and legends seemed like nothing more than silly tales for people afraid of the dark. But one evening, everything changed. What I saw left a permanent mark on me, like a scar, and now, even when I close my eyes, I can't escape the whispers. Those whispers compelled me to do things I was too terrified to even think about. The town of Ashwood, Michigan, seemed like a cozy little haven in the backwoods. A dense forest surrounded the town, and a river as clear as crystal wound its way among the old, silent houses that seemed to hide some sort of secrets. But one detail stood out from this idyllic scene: an old wooden bridge that spanned the river. Its planks were dark, as if woven from time itself and something gloomier than mere years. People called it the Cursed Bridge. And I, Jake, was bold enough to try to find out why. Among us, there was a new girl, Sarah. She was so fascinated by everything mysterious that she seemed like a character from some detective series. Sarah never went anywhere without her notebook, where she diligently jotted down everything she could find about local legends. She was curious about everything, from the history of the bridge to the eerie tales whispered by the town's elders. We became fast friends because I always craved adventure, though this time, things went way too far. They say that those who cross this bridge at midnight during a full moon hear voices calling them to the water, and those who look into their reflection never return. Sarah whispered, her eyes gleaming with an unhealthy fascination as she read from an old, time-worn journal she'd found in some antique shop. The legend told of a family that had lived near the bridge over 100 years ago and had vanished after horrific events. Their house burned to the ground, and now their souls, it was said, were intertwined with the place, like the roots of ancient trees. But that wasn't all that unsettled me. Sheriff Richardson, a stout man in his 50s with an icy stare, was unusually strict about the bridge. Not only did he forbid anyone from going near it, but he nearly lost his composure whenever someone brought up the local legends. His silent stubbornness and categorical attitude only fueled my curiosity. What did he know? Why was he so determined to keep the truth hidden? And why did his eyes gleam so strangely whenever the bridge was mentioned? Sarah and I decided to investigate the bridge that night when the full moon hung in the sky like a predatory observer. I brought a flashlight, a voice recorder, and an old, barely functioning camera. Sarah was right beside me, her face alight with anticipation. She looked like she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. At first, everything seemed ordinary. The bridge creaked under our feet, and the wind tossed dry leaves into the river. But when we reached the middle of the bridge, something changed. The air turned sharply cold, though it was a warm summer night. A shiver ran through me, as if someone had brushed against me. Then we heard it. The whisper. It came from everywhere, though we were in the open. At first, it was faint and indistinct, but the words quickly became clear. "They've come, help us, free us." I immediately thought it could be the wind or some prank by the locals. But Sarah froze, her face pale, her gaze fixed on the darkness of the forest. "Jake, look there!" she whispered, her voice trembling. I raised my flashlight and saw something. Shadows moving between the trees. Human shapes, but distorted. Their figures were warped, as though light itself couldn't properly outline them. Sarah's hands shook as she held the camera, trying nervously to record, though her eyes never left the shifting shadows. And then I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. Sharp, cold, and utterly unnatural, it sent a chill through my entire body. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me, only darkness. My flashlight revealed the empty bridge, yet the sense of an unseen presence was overwhelming. The whispers grew louder, as if they were drilling into my skull. I heard Sarah gasp, her breathing shallow and panicked. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing her hand. We bolted back the way we came, abandoning the camera and voice recorder. In the darkness, it felt as though the bridge had stretched longer, the air thickening into a fog determined to hold us back. When we finally reached the far side, my heart pounded in my throat. Sarah was silent, staring back at the bridge as if expecting the shadows to follow us. But we were alone, or almost alone. That night I couldn't sleep. The whisper stayed with me, replaying over and over like a broken record, until even the silence began to terrify me. The next day, Sarah and I decided to get to the bottom of it. Something about the whispers, the shadows, and that chilling touch wouldn't let me rest. Sarah, as always, was burning with curiosity, but now there was more fear than her usual excitement in her eyes. We headed to the town library, a place that had always seemed too quiet to me, though now the silence felt menacing. Amid the dusty shelves, we stumbled upon an old record about that family. Their names had been erased from history, but there were mentions of strange events in the days leading up to the fire. Neighbors had heard odd singing coming from their house. It wasn't ordinary music. It sounded ancient, almost ritualistic, resembling prayers but far too dark and unsettling. The account described these words as being repeated over and over, like an incantation. The most critical discovery was a mention of an old diary. The record suggested that this diary might hold the key to understanding what truly happened. It seemed to detail the events leading up to the fire and perhaps even explain why the bridge had become cursed. We learned that the diary was stored in a small museum attached to the town hall. As we navigated the narrow hallways of the old building, it felt as though the place itself was guarding its secrets. At last, we found it. The diary was ancient, its pages yellowed and its cover cracked with age. Sarah opened it, and we began to read. The entries spoke of the unthinkable. It was an account of a ritual performed more than a century ago. The townsfolk believed that some form of evil had come from the forest, something beyond their comprehension. They decided to seal it away by conducting a ceremony intended to stop the entity. But the ritual required a sacrifice. The sacrifice was the family who lived by the bridge. The diary didn't detail the exact events, but the words on its pages conveyed despair and a horrific sense of inevitability. The townspeople believed this offering would protect their village. But it didn't. Instead of banishing the evil, they awakened something even worse. Their ritual marked the beginning of a curse that became intertwined with the bridge itself. When we finished reading, I felt the cold creep over my skin once more. Sarah said nothing, but her eyes, usually brimming with curiosity, now looked hollow. The diary had raised more questions than it answered. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stirred something best left undisturbed. Sheriff Richardson found out we'd been digging through old records. One evening, he showed up at my doorstep, his stern gaze almost cutting through me. "Listen, Jake," he began, his voice low and cold. "This isn't your business. Stay away from the bridge and everything tied to it. It's for your own good." His warning felt more like a command, but instead of deterring me, it only fueled my curiosity. Sarah was equally determined. "He's hiding something, and we're going to find out what it is," she said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. She couldn't let it go, and neither could I. We decided to learn more and turned to one of the town's oldest residents, Mr. Henry, who was well known for his love of local history and legends. He hesitated for a long time before speaking, but eventually, he gave in under the weight of our persistence. "You have to understand, Sheriff Richardson doesn't want you poking around for a reason," he said with a heavy sigh. His wrinkled hands clutched a cup of tea tightly. "He's part of this story himself. His grandfather was one of the men who performed the ritual." Those words were a shock. Sarah and I exchanged glances. Mr. Henry continued. "They thought they were doing the right thing, but in reality, they doomed us all. The sheriff has spent his whole life trying to right his grandfather's mistakes. He keeps quiet because he believes it's the only way to protect the town and his family." The old man's words cast the sheriff in a new light. His anger and prohibitions now seemed less like a power trip and more like a desperate attempt to shield himself and his legacy from the repercussions of those terrible events. But instead of feeling sympathy, I felt anger. He was hiding the truth that might explain everything, and now it felt like our responsibility to uncover it, even if it meant delving deeper than we wanted. "If the sheriff thinks we'll stop, he's wrong," Sarah said, her voice filled with more resolve than fear. We decided that next time, we wouldn't just study the history. We would find out why the ritual had failed and why the sheriff was so terrified of the truth. That night, Sarah and I returned to the bridge. We had no other choice. The ritual described in the diary was our only hope to lift the curse. We were terrified, yet we felt an odd sense of determination. The forest around the bridge seemed darker than usual, and the night air was thick and oppressive. Sarah held the diary, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages, searching for the right words. I held the flashlight, double-checking to make sure we had everything prepared. We began. Sarah read the first words. Her voice was shaky, but the more she read, the more it seemed as though the night wind carried her words, amplifying them with an otherworldly power. I watched as the river beneath the bridge began to change. The water churned violently, as though something deep within was awakening. And then Sheriff Richardson appeared. His arrival was sudden, almost spectral. He emerged from the darkness, holding a shotgun, his eyes blazing with fury. "Stop this right now!" he shouted, aiming the weapon at us. "You don't even know what you're doing! We're trying to fix what your ancestors did!" Sarah yelled back, her voice unwavering as she continued reading. The sheriff looked even more enraged. He stepped closer, and in that moment, a struggle broke out between us. I tried to wrestle the shotgun from his grasp, but he was stronger than he looked. During the scuffle, his flashlight fell to the ground. As it hit, its beam illuminated the river. What we saw made us freeze. Rising from the water was a creature. Enormous, dark, horrifying. Its body seemed to be made of shadow, yet it was solid, alive. Countless arms writhed, reaching as if searching for prey. Its eyes were empty voids that stared through us, radiating a cold that pierced to the bone. "You don't understand!" the sheriff cried out, his voice almost pleading. "If you release it, it will destroy us all!" But it was too late. Sarah had finished reading. Her voice blended with the rumble of the bridge, which began to creak and crack as if something was breaking it from within. The water beneath us boiled, and the creature rose higher, its arms reaching toward the bridge, toward us. Suddenly, the sheriff lunged forward, as if trying to stop the creature. But he didn't make it in time. One of its dark hands grabbed him. He screamed, struggling to break free, but it was futile. His body disappeared into the churning darkness, and I heard his final scream drowned out by the roar of the water. That moment gave us one chance. I grabbed Sarah's hand, and we ran. Behind us, the bridge groaned and splintered, but we didn't look back. The forest felt endless, but we didn't stop until we were far from the bridge. That night, I realized we had unleashed something that should never have existed. Sarah remained silent, her face as pale as chalk. The bridge, the river, the sheriff, they were all behind us now. But the creature we had set free was now a part of our world. When we finally dared to look back, what we saw stopped us dead in our tracks, like a bolt of lightning. The bridge was gone. In its place remained only a dense, dark mist rising slowly above the roiling river. The air around us was heavy, saturated with the damp scent of decay and something putrid. The mist seemed to breathe, shifting and writhing as if it were watching us. Then, suddenly, within the impenetrable fog, we saw a figure. It appeared ghostly, yet too real to be a mere trick of the mind. The silhouette moved slowly closer until its contours became unmistakably clear. It was a human form, but wrong. Its proportions were distorted, its movements jerky, like those of a broken marionette. As the figure raised a hand in a slow, almost friendly wave, I felt my heart seize. Its face emerged from the mist, and I saw something I would never be able to forget. It was a mockery of a human face. Its eyes were empty voids, its nose barely defined, and its mouth. It was a grotesque smile. Deep, unnatural, stretching impossibly from ear to ear. It was devoid of warmth, devoid of humanity. It was the face of a nightmare that mocked us, as if knowing we were powerless to change anything. I heard Sarah let out a faint gasp. Her hand gripped mine tightly, as though she feared the mist would swallow her whole. And truthfully, I feared the same. The figure did not come any closer, but its presence was unbearable. It seemed to be watching us, assessing us, relishing in our fear. "Run!" Sarah whispered, her voice so faint I barely heard her. We bolted, sprinting away as fast as our legs could carry us. Even when the river and the forest were far behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that the smile was still with me. It clung to me like a shadow, even as we reached safety. And that night, when I closed my eyes, I still saw it, and I felt as though it was still smiling.